This is revision for urban areas. So, urbanisation, urban environment, you have to know what an urban area is. An urban area is a built-up area, such as a town or a city. Now, you haven't got to write all this down. I'm not going to wait for you to write this down. It will be recorded as I'm saying this, and it will be on Moodle anyway. And also, more importantly than that, you've written this down already. This is the same slides we've already done, okay? So it's just a refresher for you. You can jot down some notes, but I can't wait up for you because I have 162 more slides to get through. So, urbanisation is not quite the same as an urban area. It's where there's an increasing proportion of the population living in urban areas. Again, urban areas, towns and cities, urbanisation, an increase in the proportion of people living in them. More people living in towns and cities. Okay? So, I showed you in the very first lesson, a fresh-faced Mr. Murphy came into the room, probably down there, 120, and I showed you some examples of some cities, and currently the ones in 1950 that had the biggest population, and about how a lot of them were in America and Europe, whereas these days, as of 2015's data, a lot are in Asia. You know, Delhi, for example, Jakarta, Tokyo, Seoul, top 4, Shanghai, Manila, Karachi, top 7, in fact, all from Asia. Okay? And the populations aren't 10 million anymore, they're like 37, 26, 22, 22, 20, and 20, and 20, and 20 million people. So, the general point here was looking about how there's been a shift to our global south, like below the equator. Okay, in the southern hemisphere, a lot of Asia, developing countries, has seen the most growth. Okay, in European countries, there's been some growth, but not as quick. So, some key terms here: rural to urban migration, people migrating from rural to urban areas, and urban-rural migration, for the benefit of the doubt, is moving from urban to rural areas. Okay, an increase in birth rate has seen this. That rural-urban migration and increase in birth rate have both seen developing countries increase massively. There's been a high increase in birth rate, many reasons. Okay, for example, women not as in careers as much, less contraception, that kind of thing. And also, as medical care has improved, less deaths, less death rate, decrease in the death rate, therefore, more people living. Because don't forget, birth rate minus death rate is the natural increase if the birth rate is higher, which it clearly has been. Okay, high birth rate and the death rate is getting lower, which means the population is going to explode. Okay, so megacity was lesson 2. We were in this room, and I showed you that a megacity has a population of more than 10 million people. That's what the definition of megacity means. A city with more than 10 million people. If it has 9,999,999, no go, not megacity. If it has 10,000,001, it is a megacity. Okay? Some examples I showed you: London, Paris, Beijing, Mumbai, LA, and Moscow. And you even went and found your own for your homework, if you remember. So I showed you how megacities grow over time and how they develop. So in terms of economic growth and getting that economy moving before businesses move into the area, therefore more jobs come available, therefore people move for the jobs, therefore the city gets larger, and this cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. Now there's been some pros and cons to this. So as a result of the city growing, megacities, you get more hospitals, more police, more tourists, which can be good and bad. More facilities, better education, more jobs and increased wages. However, with more people becomes more traffic, higher rents. Again, more tourists getting in the way. Higher house prices because the demand increases, and the shops and the price in the shops increases too. So, I then, back in that room in week 2, introduced you to the idea of counter-urbanisation. Okay? The idea where people move from urban back to rural areas, like a counter-attack, a counter-move, representing a reversal of traditional urbanisation. Okay? So whereas people would move, I'm going to go to London and New York and find my destiny and get a job. Actually, this is the opposite of that. People moving out of the city, choosing to move out of the city, for better quality of life, bigger houses, for example. And we looked at some of this stuff, push and pull factors. So a push factor, something that effectively pushes you out of an area. A pull factor, something that makes you want to live there and pulls you in. Okay? We then looked at the idea of suburbanisation, not the same as counter-urbanisation. Suburbanisation is when the people or population shifts from city centres and rural areas to the outside of cities. So still in the cities, but the suburban areas. Suburbanisation, suburb areas, okay? People do this, especially as transport links increase and get better, because you can move into the city centre and go to work quite easily and quite quickly, but also cleaner air, more green space, nicer quality of life, less traffic, less congestion. Look at the picture here, for example. You can see about how it's actually better quality of life, more green space, gardens, better for a family, whereas not high-rise flats with poor quality of sanitation or poor quality of size of housing, for example.
Sir, is this AI?
That picture is there. So, why do rates differ? Basically, urbanisation rates differ globally to varying economic development levels. So LICs are getting faster growth because they come from a lower place, whereas more developed nations are kind of going a bit slower because there's different push and pull factors at play. And population is split, so a lot of people live in different places all over the world, a lot in Asia, of course, but don't forget that a lot of people live in the coasts for jobs and for work and employment. And the DTM, the demographic transition model. This is the model that countries go through from not developed to the most developed. Okay? So remember, stage 1, I showed you this, you've got a handout copy of this. Stage 1, if you're a really undeveloped country, there's lots of deaths and there's lots of births. Lots of births because less contraception, lots of births because the mother is at home most of the time, and lots of deaths because the healthcare isn't that good. And as time goes on, as the country becomes more developed, the birth rate stays high for a little bit longer before going down when contraception is available and women find careers, but the death rate does fall quite quickly as healthcare improves. And as the death rate falls down and the birth rate is still quite high, or at least higher, the population starts to increase. Okay? Right at the end, you start to see birth rate go below death rate because people are choosing to prioritise their careers over having families. They're choosing not to have children. They don't need to economically. So I showed you the problems of rapid urbanisation. So how it causes congestion, strain on infrastructure, more housing needed, more sanitation needed, increased poverty, all those things. And then how you can maybe do land use zoning as a method to counteract this. So I showed you this model here, and then this model here, the Burgess model, if you remember. And this is how the city is structured, a bit like an egg, and about how you can plan where things go, where roads go, where people live, where you have more space to build bigger housing. Before the idea of settlement hierarchies, so the division of different types of settlements driven by population, so small settlements in the countryside, large ones in the urban areas. I showed you a little bit about how this looks in a model. Before, this idea of spheres of influence. So a sphere of influence is defined as the area served by a particular settlement. So the size of the place, the infrastructure in the town, the transport available, and the level of competition as well. This may feel like a while ago, but I also ran you through very briefly high and low order goods. So functions, what a settlement does, and kind of what its purpose is. And then high order services and goods have a higher threshold population, and lower has a lower threshold population, a smaller range. So basically things that need to be imported versus things that you can get around the corner. Okay? I showed you an example of what a sphere of influence looks like. Before site and situations, definitions there for you. Site, tab of land the settlement is built on. Situation, the situation of a settlement describes its location in relation to different physical features. And then we looked at more of the problems with some examples. So you had this as a handout again, but some of the problems in rapid urbanisation. People move into the cities very, 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 very quickly and very suddenly in recent times. So the environmental quality goes down, crime increases, health gets worse, sanitation gets worse. These are often linked together, by the way. Transport becomes more crowded, housing becomes more of a strain, and people obviously have to live in maybe less good quality housing if they can't keep up with the infrastructure, and then congestion also links to transport too, and education and employment can become bad if they're simply oversubscribed and there's too many people to cope with the number of school places and jobs. So you have all those problems there categorised. I showed you Brazil as a really brief example, not necessarily a case study at this point, but about how land is used in Rio, from being near the ports, having lots of housing, to further up in the mountains having not done that. I showed you these factors here. So economic activities, transport, land value, population density, planning regulation, historical development, environmental factors and social factors of this process. CB, so I broke down for you the Burgess model a little bit. So the CBD is the middle bit, right in the centre, the central business district, and then you go to the inner city, slightly further out, the suburbs, and then the rural urban fringe right at the end, where in LEDCs you will have something called squatter settlements, like favelas, the same thing, slums in Brazil, a favela, and what the conditions are like in each and how they differ. So make sure you familiarise yourself with how the city is different and different areas of it, and how it looks different in poor and rich countries. Now, socio-economic, I'm sure you'll use this in the exam at some point, not just my one, but the real one. Socio-economic is how an event or policy or activity affects people and the economy. Okay, so for example, more jobs affects people because they have an income, but also affects the economy because they're paying tax, and also there's money being made there. So the case study that I showed you, the first official big case study, which I'm not going to read all over that, but you have these handouts already, which I would familiarise yourself with, is London. Okay? Now normally you get one case study of a poor country, one of a rich country. You might find out that we've done 2 and 2 for this bit here, okay? So I showed you London. I showed you about how London's changed over time, and about how it coped with the changes. More London, more London, more London, more London. Okay, good and bad evaluation here. So, familiarise yourself with London, perhaps make some flashcards. And about how land use then differs, you have to have some aspect to compare it to. But I kept going in London, I showed you about how the Docklands opened and changed over time. Greenfield sites and brownfield sites, for example. So greenfield, areas of land that have no buildings on it, have not been built on before, whereas brownfield is an area of land that has been built on before. There are pros and cons of building on each of them. Okay? Some are more expensive, for example, greenfield is more expensive, but sometimes there's more space. Brownfield can be bad for the environment, but ultimately it's already been built on, so it's not too bad. Then I had to show you a different example. So I finished up with London here, and some of the problems we went over, so dereliction, deprivation, deindustrialisation, all these things, how London changed. And then finally, with London, looks at the opportunities, so how these changes have increased diversity, more TNCs come to the area, and the urban greening that now happens. So you fill this table in about how that's happened, and what London is doing to make the environment better as well. Living walls, for example, congestion charge, for example, ultra low emission, ULEZ, that was a homework, don't forget that. And then we matched the definitions up there, lovely stuff. Docklands being a very good example of how an area has gone through the process of being deprived and then regenerated. So it's come out the other side and been improved. So that's what regeneration means. A long-term project to redevelop or upgrade a place that's gone into decline. And then, not only looking about who's done this regeneration project, but also how much it costs and all the pros and cons of that. Some of the challenges too. We now showed you some environmental things like beds, and if you remember that, and about how they treat waste, and urban greening, bike sharing schemes, before looking at the other example of Manchester. So I showed you about London, I showed you about Manchester. So Manchester, this is urban land use and structure. I showed you a bit of the history of Manchester, about how it has grown to be the city it is today. I gave you some facts and figures about how it was trading over the 1800s and 1900s, with cotton mainly in the mills and textiles. I showed you about how it became a bit overcrowded. People started to move out to the outskirts a little bit. Inner city then declined because people had moved out of the city. Therefore, new housing was needed. Therefore, new services were needed, new schools, new hospitals, people moving outside the city. Then we basically became the growth and the factories closing. So you started to have regeneration coming in 1987. And again, just another example of how a UK city or a HIC city has improved, regenerated, changed over time with the changes that have happened. So I recommend you know London and Manchester case studies as examples of kind of urban environments in a HIC. If you're asked in the exam for a HIC, it's not London, it's not Manchester, it's the UK. And you can use either example or even both to make your answer even better. That's why I taught you two. Before, in terms of a varied approach, I also showed you a different case study, an LIC example. So your LIC example was not Manchester or London, okay? It was, you remember? Yes. So a squatter settlement. A squatter settlement. It's fine. Is a residential area often found in urban areas of developing countries, where people live in normally homes that are self-constructed or self-made, or maybe on land they don't even naturally legally own or have permission to occupy. So people live in these places often because they have no choice to do so. They have not got the money to get out of there. So you have cities, such as the one we'll look at in a minute, that look like this, but also have that in the background as well as areas have developed. So I showed you about location, government support, community organisation, security, access to tech, legal status, external aid, and local leadership as terms of answers to tackle these problems. And yes, it was Nairobi. So the importance of the economy in this area, often the informal economy. So not jobs or rents that are going through legally lawful practices or contracts, but instead, do this favour for me, I'll give you the cash. Okay? Which means tax is not paid on that. That's why it's informal. Tax is not paid on that. So that could be things like hairdressing, street vending, riding local taxi services, boda. That's the kind of quality of detail for case studies you need to get a grade grade 7, 8 or 9. Okay? Having that case study specific, not just saying, oh yes, people did jobs in the streets. Having those examples is really, really, really good. Before I showed you about how to manage slum areas. So, about maybe clearing it away, or redeveloping the area, or improving by self-help being this stuff here, schemes where you give the people tools to help themselves. Self-help schemes that make them help themselves, okay? Whether that's free training, education, low interest loans, or volunteers sharing knowledge. I showed you this example here of maybe a house that's built that can enable self-help schemes. So yeah, I showed you Nairobi as an example more specifically about how they've gone through the wide range of self-help schemes they have done. And then you also did a homework, if you remember, of Babylonia. This is not, in my limited memory, this was not Nairobi. This was in Brazil. So I gave you a different example for your homework of Brazil, so you can almost compare it to Nairobi. I would say Nairobi is your main case study for LIC City, okay? But you can also use your homework for Brazil that you did, because in one lesson we looked at Sao Paulo, and about how that also has a squatter settlement. I gave you some facts and figures about Brazil and Sao Paulo more generally, about how it changed over time, similar to that of Manchester, don't forget. How the TNCs can invest in there, the urban growth. Again, some facts and figures about how they've been through this process of manufacturing before, the problems they've encountered, the solutions they tried to tackle, neighbourhood associations in the favelas, for example, more self-help schemes and loans. And yeah, so you have Nairobi and you have Brazil, Sao Paulo to help you in terms of the LIC or developing country examples. Okay? Urban areas more generally, we can see where most people live and the impact of Asia and also the USA as well. I've done that twice. I've put that there twice as well. So before we finish, which we're nearly on the end of the slides here, I want to tell you, let's take a step back and look at the whole topic more generally. Okay? The physical definition of the city is a non-rural settlement that's built up for economic factors, it's built up, has a local government and maybe even a legal boundary. Okay? Definitions of primate city, of world city, familiarise yourselves with these, they're not just megacity, okay? Primate city and world city. A megacity I already went through with you, but a megalopolis is a very large, heavily populated city or urban complex. So it's about knowing these definitions. Skyscrapers, building vertically because then you have more space on the ground. Outward expansion, making the city bigger maybe from urban sprawl. This is easy to do now because with more trains and cars and stuff you can actually live further away and get into the centre in a shorter space of time. Changing what the Burgess model looks like if you remember. And then how cities are spread out, distribution of them, physical restraints, why can't you build everywhere, and economic functions. certainly with an international distribution being kind of at the heart of this. 2. Before the theory lesson, really, to end off with, so yeah, Burgess model I went through with you, patterns over time, zones of transition, this theory here about how areas are changing and becoming different in terms of their zonage. The Hoyt sector model I went through with you looked like that. If you remember, the Ullman and Harris multiple nuclei model. Again, this is more theory stuff. I'm not quite sure you need this as a centre point of an exam question in any exam that you do. But you can always refer to these models if it applies to the question you're writing for. Because you have that model there. Griffin and Ford's model we went through. A bit of revision about Brown and Greenfield sites, so I would know the difference of those and where they feature. And then looking at how we can be more sustainable. So how cities can improve and be more sustainable. Okay? So for example, basically using clean energy, relying on the public rather than private transport, improving infrastructure, making it more maybe heat, insulate, for example. I just know your key terms. It's a really, really important point. Push factor, pull factor, sustainable, renewable resource, non-renewable resource. Knowing those key topics and how they differ. And then just a bit I want to put in right at the end, which I haven't gone through with you yet. There's only 3 slides left. But I wanted to show you about how this fits into the UN's global plan, about how do we make cities better ultimately. So it's part of the global development goals outlined by the United Nations. Okay? So making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. So it's how you evaluate cities, how to make them safe for all people, how to make them inclusive for all people, okay? Whether it be gender, whether it be disabilities, whether it be race, ethnicity, whatever it may be. Resilient, are they strong enough? Can they cope with the demands of an increasing population? And also, sustainable. Can these cities be here forever? Can they live onwards? So a good example for this, by the way, I haven't taught you yet, but very briefly, here it is Masdar City, okay? So Abu Dhabi, UAE, they only built it in 2008, that's when they started, and the plan was for it to be home to about 40,000 people. It's not quite finished yet, but it's well on the way. It looks a little bit like this. And it's the idea of the sustainable city. So everything there was built in mind of the UN goals, development outlines, being inclusive, safe, resilient, and crucially, sustainable. Sustainable being you can live almost forever. Not as a person, but what I mean by that is this city can go on for future generations to do the same.